So I want to start again recognizing that I can be a little repetitive in that I have a captive audience here. And just a reminder that our lectionary came together over 40 years ago. So sometime in the early 80s, 1970s, it was decided that on February 16th of 2025, this should be the set of readings that we would have, and so therefore we have read them. And one of the things that particularly during these green times of year are the times of year where Jesus is often telling us how to do stuff, where we would rather Jesus didn't tell us how to do stuff. To say, hey, I'm minding my own lane here, and why don't you do you somewhere else, and maybe causes us to leave the sanctuary on a Sunday going, that Jesus guy, not so sure about that. When we look at the text that we have for today, it's pretty familiar to us. It's one of the Beatitudes, but the Beatitudes sometimes are referred to by a different name. Probably you've heard of it. We think of the blessings on the mount or things like this. We think of that. But that's not from Luke. Do you notice in the gospel today, Jesus comes down to a level place. Level. On the same level, we might say. And speaks to the people who are there. And he says things that are blunt and kind of challenging. Blessed or happy are those who are poor. Blessed are those who are hungry. Blessed are those who grieve. Woe to those who are rich. Woe to those who are full. We have a set of readings that are crystal clear. And it's one of those reading sets where we start to get a little funny about how we understand these words. And you can see it even in the Sermon on the Mount, where Matthew, in his gospel, is taking the same reading, but he got a little nervous about it. I'm thinking Matthew must have been serving a parish in Palo Alto. And so when he got the text, he decided, I'm going to tweak this just a little bit so that it lands a little better on the ear. And so on this, we have Jesus up above, the crowd below. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It just kind of changes it a little bit. Generally, in biblical scholarship, when a quote is used in multiple places, the rule of thumb is that the shorter version is more authentic. The embellished versions are ones that they tried later to fix, right? Or I noticed when I read this from Luke last year, people got upset. I tweaked it just a little bit and they like it a lot better, right? Right? That's kind of what we like to do. Now, when we have the readings and we put them over and against the news of the week, sometimes it's not always as crystal clear how it goes together. But reading the Beatitudes over and against the image of the world's richest man, feeding programs that are intended to help those who are poor and hungry, with a certain amount of glee into the wood chipper, or referring to the poor as the parasite class, it's a great example of what is the opposite of what Jesus is telling us. Now, we may have all kinds of different ideas on the best way to engage in those kinds of problems in our society, and it is a valid discussion to debate whether the current way of handling that is the best way to do it. But the richest man's glee over the parasite class, I think the Greek word is, it's gross, I think is the Greek word, gross. But it's a challenge for us because if there are two things that I want you to think of in regards to the Beatitudes in the text that we have today, is that, yes, Jesus is speaking in regards specifically to poverty. People who are looking at their checking account balance and it's not working to get them where they need to go. Jesus is also not asking his disciples, can you please vet this crowd so that we don't accidentally help somebody who doesn't deserve it? Can you come up with a questionnaire and just kind of go through, whittle down the group so that we can kind of get on it? And before we heal anybody, just make sure that their insurance card is current, right? That's not a vibe anywhere in the Gospels. Now, to be fair, insurance cards really weren't a thing in first century Palestine. But nonetheless, you get the idea. Now, when we think of poor and hungry, we're in the Gospel of Mark. And so how do we consider this idea of poor and hungry? In the Gospel of Luke, we have to compare this to other stories in the Gospel of Luke. So we might think of the story of Lazarus and the rich man. We think of Lazarus, who has sores on his body that are being licked by the dogs, and he's out in front of the rich man's house, and he dies and goes to heaven, and then the rich man dies and goes somewhere else. We might think of the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Where the good person is the wrong person to be the good person, right? And goes down into the ditch personally to help this man who is beaten and wounded, not asking for a deposit on care that might be necessary later, not evaluating, hey, is this safe for me? This guy got beat up. Maybe I could get beat up. But rather go and do. But perhaps one of the most critical stories that we have in the Gospel of Luke comes at the very beginning of the Gospel. Not quite the very beginning, but very close to the beginning, where Mary has discovered that she is pregnant. She goes to visit her relative Elizabeth and then bursts into song. Now, if you are a singer, there's room, by the way, if you didn't catch that earlier. If you are a singer or have been in church a long time, you know the Latin term for this, right? The Magnificat. It is where the mighty are thrown from their thrones and the lowly are lifted up. This is the context in the Gospel of Luke into which this Sermon on the Plain, as it's sometimes called, enters into our discussion. Now, when we think about this, we come up with a lot of different reasons why at times it's difficult to help in this kind of fashion. And one of the obstacles, perhaps in Matthew's, not mine, of course, but the gospel writer Matthew, is our own hearts. Our own hearts. You heard in one of the earlier readings, I think it was the one that Wally read, it says that our hearts are devious. Or to say it a little differently, our hearts are consumed first with ourselves and often only on ourselves. Not towards others in whether they are worthy or not, but this self-focus. We confess that we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. We have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed by what we have done and by what we have left undone. One piece of this puzzle is what we've been discussing so far, this idea of rich and poor. The second piece of this is that a reminder that we are a part of this problem as well. when we are baptized, it is as if we have dovetailed with Christ. Our lives become the lives of Christ. Christ's heart is in our chest. We would say, don't follow your own heart. Follow the heart of Christ in this time and in these days. Turn outward towards others, asking first what their need is, not first whether they are worthy of help. It's different. It's very different. When we think of rich and poor, one of the things that I'm mindful of, being Matthew, who serves a parish in Palo Alto, is that when I was a kid in the 70s, I thought $1 million was going to be a lot of money, right? And it turns out that $1 million, it is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. And while it may not feel like it based on our own checking account balance, if we look at North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Central and Eastern Asia, South Asia, if we think of the whole planet and then put Palo Alto in there, we are the rich. We are the rich. So, if we put these pieces together, the two pieces are that our hearts are captive to our own concern. And it's important for us to call out when we hear the poor and the hungry mischaracterized and injured. But at the same time, we also need to remember that we are a part of this cycle as well. And that in our baptisms, we are called to take on the heart of Christ in a way that moves us beyond ourselves and towards those who are most hurting. Seems perfectly appropriate to be remembering ecumenical hunger program in East Palo Alto and any number of things. But as you leave this place, be mindful of Christ's call to be oriented towards others, and particularly to those who are hurting the most. Very last thing, I want to talk about singing. The hymn of the day, Tim does a great job picking the hymns, and today in particular, the hymn of the day is a Spanish language hymn. We'll sing it in English, although feel free to jump in the Spanish if you like. Note the words. And I also wanted to point out that the closing hymn is a rousing hymn. So I expect to hear rousing. Canticle of the Turning, which is based on the Magnificat that I discussed just a little bit ago. So please note those as we move on with the service. Please stand as you are able.